Thanks everyone who came on time. We really appreciate it. And we got to start. My name is Maria and I run Точкой, and here are a few more colleagues of mine and you can see them. And this is a project where we collaborate with the Tzedek centers, Merkazim Tzedek. You can see Sasha who represents them there. During this hard times, we decided to look for information because it's hard to understand what's happening and we want balanced perspective. And we thought that Iran might have one and maybe he can share. And Iran, as you know, is a political analyst, a former head of policy planning at Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and a former deputy head of the National Security Council in the Prime Minister's office. And now he works as a researcher at the research center called МИД. We're gonna record this webinar. First, Erhan will talk like for 25 minutes, and then we'll have enough time for questions. Prepare your questions. Raise up the hand on Zoom. Write your questions in the comments, and we'll cover everything. And Erhan, the floor is yours. Thanks for coming to us.
Hi everyone. It's very good to be here. I hope you can hear me well. I'm using my cell phone and not my computer, so I hope it's okay. Good. So I'll try to cover within 25 minutes some of the complexities of the historic moment we're in, and we'll see how successful I can be. I'll start by saying that the Israeli-Iran tensions have been in place for over 30 years. When I joined the foreign ministry, the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was Prime Minister, and Shimon Peres was Foreign Minister. And Rabin's entire doctrine, what is now perhaps known to some of you as the peace process, as the Oslo process, as whatever it is that Rabin was trying to do and unfortunately was murdered for it, was actually part of a bigger strategy that to no small extent was centered around Iran. And the way he kind of framed his entire strategy was, to my mind, was very succinct and very clever and very strategic. And in parentheses, I would say that not all Israeli prime ministers were great strategists, to say the least, but he was. And the way that he connected the two major, what he saw and what everybody else understands as the two major challenges for Israel's long-term national security, the Iranian issue and the Palestinian issue, was the following. He said at the time, and be reminded, this is the early 1990s. He said the following: we, Israel, need to close the circle of peace before Iran closes the fuel cycle. Okay, the cycle of peace and the cycle of fuel, and I'll explain. What he meant by the cycle of peace was, if you can imagine, the map of Israel and our immediate vicinity, or what we call in the professional language the first circle around Israel, the countries that actually border us, which are Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and obviously the Palestinians. He aimed at closing the cycle of peace, the circle of peace, throughout these nations. In other words, peace with Syria, that should have kind of brought about peace with Lebanon, peace with Jordan, and peace with the Palestinians. We are already after the peace agreement with Egypt, obviously, which was in the 80s. And so this is what he means by the cycle of peace, or the circle of peace. And the fuel cycle is the nuclear fuel cycle that a country needs to master technologically, scientifically, as a prerequisite for obtaining nuclear weapon. And at the time, Iran was pretty far away from closing that fuel cycle. Now, unfortunately, Rabin was assassinated before he was able to complete the circle of peace. He was able to bring about the Oslo Accords and the peace with Jordan. And he wasn't able. He started negotiating with Syria, but he was, again, assassinated before he was able to close the circle of peace. However, Iran, between the 1990s and today, 2025, not only has closed and mastered the fuel cycle, but has advanced much, much, much more on its nuclear effort, and is now what is professionally known as a threshold state. And it's very critical to understand what it means, a threshold state. It means that the only thing that stands between Iran and a military nuclear capability is an Iranian decision. That's it. All they have to do is to decide to break to a bomb or to it doesn't have to be a breakage or a race. They just need to decide that they want to have it, and they will have it. Nobody now, not Israel, not the US, is in a position to forcefully prevent them from reaching military nuclear capability. So that's kind of the first thing that I would like you to understand. First of all, the Rabin strategy that tied both issues, the Palestinian issue and the overall issue of peace, with the Iranian situation, and essentially aimed at creating stability, long-term stability via peace agreements between Israel and all its neighbors as a countermeasure against Iran and as a preemptive measure in order to prevent Iran from achieving military nuclear capability. This was in the mid-90s. And fast forward to today, we were not able to close the circle of peace, unfortunately. I don't have time now to kind of go over the entire history, but unfortunately, some Israeli prime ministers tried to follow in Rabin's footsteps, mainly Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert, and close the circle of peace with the Palestinians and others. But Netanyahu obviously had a very different strategy, which essentially aimed at annihilating any option for closing the circle of peace by annihilating any kind of peace with the Palestinians based on the two-state solution. And Iran at the time, throughout that time, was allowed to pursue its nuclear ambitions with one kind of critical point in time, the so-called JCPOA, the agreement that President Obama and the entire group of superpowers, the Russians, the Chinese, the Europeans, the EU3 so-called, struck, as you know, the JCPOA in 2015, which was a good agreement that stopped Iran in terms of its nuclear advancement. But unfortunately, in 2018, if I remember correctly, Trump decided, under the kind of vigorous encouragement of Netanyahu, to pull out of the JCPOA. And since then, things started to deteriorate. Iran advanced more and more quickly and more significantly in terms of its nuclear capabilities. And as I said before, crossed the threshold. So this is just kind of as a baseline for the discussion of where we are now and what is that, why did we get to a war, and what are the options from here forward. So if Rabin's strategy was to close the circle of peace in order to prevent Iran from closing the fuel cycle, Netanyahu's strategy is very different. Netanyahu's strategy essentially was, I will bypass the Palestinians because I have no interest in striking any kind of a peace agreement with them. My solution, Netanyahu's solution to the Palestinian problem was never really outlined. And I have my own theory. I don't have now time to elaborate, but it's certainly annihilating any possibility of a two-state solution and annihilating the Oslo Accords. This is what he was trying to do, and unfortunately, he was very successful at that. And on Iran, he essentially, and here, he never said it out loud, but his strategy was to drag the US into a war with Iran so that there will be a quote-unquote a military solution to the Iranian nuclear problem. And of course, he wanted to do it in a way which will not create damages for Israel in terms of US public opinion and US political echelons and so on. So he tried it in various ways, unsuccessfully so far. And what is happening now, essentially, is that, very interestingly, from a historical perspective, while October 7th was an unfortunately very successful attempt by Mohammad Sinwar, with probably very deep Iranian involvement, to reshuffle the strategic cards and to create a situation whereby the Palestinian issue, which was marginalized up until then for a variety of reasons, but first and foremost because this was Netanyahu's strategy, the so-called Abraham Accords, which are bypassing the Palestinians. So, and obviously the attempt to normalize relations with the Saudis and all of that. I understand you're following the news, so you probably remember that. So on October 7th, the cards were shuffled in such a way that put the Palestinian issue back on the center stage of the global scene, if you want. And you all know what happened in the last 2 years in terms of Gaza. Again, we don't have enough time to elaborate the actual ramifications of that. But as you also know, Israel was able to strike a very significant blow to Hezbollah, which obviously is an Iranian proxy. As a result of that, there was a regime change in Syria that nobody really anticipated and was not part of the Israeli planning, but this is what happens in wartime situations, the law of unintended consequences. So very quickly, the regime in Syria was toppled from within, and thus the three elements of the so-called ring of fire or choke ring that Iran built over the years around Israel, which consisted of the Islamic Jihad and Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and some assets in Syria and the Syrian regime and the Syrian army, if you want, itself, and also some other militias in Yemen, the Houthis, and in Iraq. This entire apparatus of Iranian proxies, which worked very well for the Iranians for decades, suddenly received a devastating blow. And this created a situation which, from, shall we say, a strategic Israeli perspective, an objective Israeli perspective, was a historic opportunity to deal with Iran itself and the Iranian nuclear project. So this is, again, still in terms of background of how did we get to this war. There's a lot to be said about the American position. Again, I have to cut short, and maybe you can ask me questions later if that's of interest. But historically, American presidents did not seek, certainly not a regime change in Iran, and not a military solution to the Iranian nuclear problem. Most, if not all, American presidents sought to avoid another adventure in the Middle East, certainly after the two strategic disasters that they brought upon themselves in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and also a similar situation in Libya and elsewhere. All these adventures of a regime change have scarred the Americans, both the American people, that now doesn't want to hear about any more adventures in the Middle East, certainly not a regime change, and American presidents, American military planners, the entire American national security apparatus. They have no appetite for more such adventures. And this was very true about Trump himself, which throughout his political campaign promised, one of his main promises was no more big wars. And if you were to say, to describe to any American, let's say, I don't know, even 3 months ago, let alone 6 months ago or during the election campaign, that in June 2025, Trump will be on the verge of a decision to enter into another big war in the Middle East in order to bring about a regime change without any credible intelligence and without any direct attack on the US, anybody would tell you you're delusional. Makes no sense, not going to happen. You know, it's not America's interest. It runs against Trump's political interests. It runs against clearly the will of the American people and so on and so forth. But here we are. How did it happen is a fascinating question. It will be researched and debated and discussed for probably decades to come. But as a first draft of history, you can read the New York Times from, I believe, the day before yesterday, a very detailed story that actually tells a very interesting story of essentially Trump being lobbied by Netanyahu and by some of his kind of associates, in Netanyahu's associates in the close circles to Trump, essentially being lobbied to intervene and to go to war with Iran. Contrary again to his instincts, to his interests, and so on. And it's a fascinating story. It's a highly recommended reading, but the bottom line is that Netanyahu was able to do what he was not able to do with any other president, even though he tried, which is to lure them or to drag them into yet another adventure in the Middle East. We'll see again if it happens, but right now it looks quite possible that it will. Going back to the perspective of Israel and the strategy of Israel and the war aims and all of that. So after everything that transpired in Gaza and in Lebanon and in Syria, and given the fact that Iran was continuously advancing its nuclear project, the Israeli narrative, which again, and I'll describe it and then I'll qualify what I'm going to say. The Israeli narrative is that in the last few weeks, few months, they were able to gather new intelligence that amounts to what is known professionally as a dash to a bomb. In other words, Iran decided to made the decision that I mentioned before, that the decision to achieve military nuclear capability. And in parentheses, it's important to understand that Iran's public posture has always been that we're not seeking military nuclear capability. All we're seeking is civilian nuclear capability, and that all intelligence assessments by the Americans, by the Europeans, by everybody, up until 3 weeks ago. The latest report was published three weeks ago by the DNI, Directorate of National Intelligence, which is the summation of all intelligence assessments of all American organizations, CIA, Pentagon, State Department, and so on. The bottom line of this assessment was that Iran does not have an active nuclear weapon program and is not seeking nuclear weapon. And also the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the international authority for nuclear issues and which is the monitoring organization that monitors the NPT and every other nuclear-related agreement in the world. The IAEA also, in its latest report, which was published maybe a week ago, incriminates Iran in all sorts of activities, but doesn't reveal any new information, essentially saying that Iran does not have an active weapons program and is not pursuing nuclear weapons, but is not disclosing all of its activities. Again, it's a long story. I'm simplifying it because we don't have time. So, Israel is telling a certain story. More and more in recent days, neither the Americans nor the Europeans, the professional establishments, intelligence, military, and so on, are not buying this story. They're essentially saying, more officially, less officially, that Israel's reading of the intelligence is not acceptable from their perspective. But very importantly, Trump himself, there is a video from maybe 2 days ago of a journalist asking him, wait a minute, why are you contemplating going to war with Iran if your own chief of intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, the head of the DNI, is stating, both in writing and verbally, that there is no cause, that Iran is not dashing to a bomb. And Trump literally is kind of waving his hand, you know, in this kind of gesture, and saying, well, she can say what she wants. I believe that they are. So Netanyahu decided, probably now he's saying, if I remember correctly, that it was in last November, something like that, that this is the opportune moment to initiate what is a war of choice. Even though he's describing it as a war of no choice, it is definitely a war of choice against Iran for the first time in Israel's history. And you need to, I mean, you cannot overestimate the significance of that decision, because Israel did not declare war on any state, on any nation, since, what is it, 1982, you know, arguably, Lebanon, and did not fight a state, like an actual state, as compared to a non-state actor like Hamas and Hezbollah, has not fought a state since 1973. And of course, never fought Iran outside those two relatively limited rounds exchange of missiles and bombs in the last year. So it's really a momentous, historic decision that cannot be overestimated. And Netanyahu took it. And his story is that he took it because he had no other choice, because they were dashing to a bomb. But I think there will be a lot of question marks around this narrative. Now, what are the war aims? First of all, you should know that, you know, in any country, but especially in Israel, the definition, the exact definition of the war aims is the most critical issue when it comes to any war. And there's a long and painful history with respect to that again, I urge you to read and familiar yourselves with. It's pertinent to the war in Gaza, and it's very pertinent to this new war now against Iran. Now, the official war aims were not published. I'll give you my assessment of what they are, and we'll take it from there in terms of thinking what can happen from now. There are essentially two pretty clear war aims, and then there's another one which is more ambiguous. The first one has to do with the nuclear project. And I believe that the formulation of the war aim is not we will eliminate nuclear project, but rather we will inflict significant damage on the nuclear project with a view to stalling the Iranian nuclear effort as much as possible. Now, what does it mean in actual terms? If you ask Ehud Barak, he will tell you it is measured in weeks, the stalling. If you ask some other people, they will tell you it is measured in months. And if you ask maybe other peoples, including those that were perhaps part of the decision-making process, they might tell you a year, maybe 2 years. But this is not exact science. And I think the most important thing you need to understand is that when the war began, as I said before, the only thing that really stood between Iran and achieving military nuclear capability is an Iranian decision. And it is still true today, and it will probably be true when the war is over, unless we have a regime change. I'll elaborate in a minute. So I think the decision was not to annihilate the project, but to inflict serious damage in order to stall the advancement. So that's the first war aim. The second has to do with the missiles. And this is relatively new. Netanyahu has now redefined and reframed the missiles threat from Iran, which was obviously always on the table. But he has now upgraded it to a level almost similar to the nuclear threat, which I find very dubious. And he essentially says, they already have thousands of missiles. They are constantly upgrading them in terms of precision, in terms of all sorts of systems that make it more and more difficult to intercept. And they're manufacturing thousands of them. So in a year or 2 years from now, they will have a critical mass, which will be what he calls an existential threat on Israel. And therefore, we cannot tolerate it, and the time to act is now. So what is the war aim here? Again, I don't think it is eliminating the entire apparatus of Iranian missiles and manufacturing capabilities, because that would be an inachievable goal. But again, inflicting serious damage, stalling, and so on and so forth. So these are the two kind of clear objectives that were more or less also stated publicly. The third one is the more ambiguous and more potentially consequential, but also very dangerous, and that has to do with the regime. I find it difficult to believe that there was an actual decision by any Israeli cabinet, even this cabinet, which is the most extreme we ever had and the less capable we ever had, to formally decide that we, Israel, will change the regime in Iran. I would expect, the chief of the IDF, the head of Mossad, all the other professionals around the table, if such a decision would have been attempted, to get up and say, I'm not going to sign off on that. Because there is no plan that we, Israel, can plan and execute that will guarantee a regime change in Iran. Simply not possible. And furthermore, there is nobody that can guarantee that even if somehow the current regime is toppled, that the new regime, which will take its place, will be more convenient and less extreme and less inclined to achieve a nuclear capability or to continue to build missiles. Nobody is in a position to promise that under any stretch of the imagination. So I don't believe that the decision was to change the regime, but I think that there was a decision to undermine the regime and to weaken the regime's grasp of power and its command and control over the military and over intelligence services and so on and so forth, as part of an overall war effort designed to win over this very sophisticated and capable enemy. Now there's the issue of the role of the US in this in terms of Israeli planning and war aims. And here too, I suspect that there was I'm sure there were a lot of deliberations on that. I find it hard to believe that there was a formal decision that Israel is seeking American intervention as part of the plan. It's not totally impossible, but it will surprise me. However, I'm quite sure that in terms of Netanyahu's real aims, he absolutely sought and is still seeking, as I said before, because that's something he has been seeking for decades, to drag the Americans in and so-called to bring them to finishing the job, if you will. So that's what I can say about the planning and the strategy and all of that. Now, very quickly, because we're already half an hour, I'll tell you what I think the possible scenarios are from here on, and then we'll open it to questions. I see a number of possible scenarios. The first is, shall we say, the most optimistic ideal, if you want, from an Israeli perspective, which is an Iranian surrender and even a collapse of the regime. I think it is not very likely, but I suspect that because of the degree of success that we had militarily, which was unimaginable, I'm quite sure is a strategic surprise, not only to the Iranians and Americans and Europeans and Saudis, but also to the Israelis themselves. We did not think that it would be that successful, that quickly, that significant, and so on. So I believe now there is what the Americans call a mission creep. And the Israelis, with Netanyahu personally, with a lot of hubris and historic kind of consciousness, he's the son of a historian, as you know, and has always sought to kind of etch his name in Israeli history. So he's pretty much probably carried away with the initial success. And it's not unimaginable that he is actually now seeking, as Trump tweeted, total surrender of the Iranians and a regime change. So that's the first scenario. I give it low probability. The second is that Iran, under the new strategic circumstances, chooses to change strategy and to break to a bomb. And here, if you read Israeli press, they tell you a lot of stories now about Fordow, which is, the most fortressed Iranian installation that has the most advanced centrifuges and is buried 100 meters below a mountain and so on. And Israel doesn't have the capability to strike it from the air. So they want the Americans to do it. And the story goes that, once Fordow is eliminated, then that's it. The Iranian nuclear project is gone, and that's end of story. Well, that's not true, probably. Iran has probably the capacity, the capability to dash to a bomb, even if Fordow is bombed. And they might choose to do it, if you want, as a last resort, or close to a last resort. And they have the means to do it, probably, and they might choose to do it. They might also choose to escalate via other means. They can attack some oil fields in the Gulf. They can block the Hormuz Straits, which will spike the oil prices and create global economic issues. And there's a lot of other stuff that they can do in order to escalate. The third scenario is a scenario of attrition, which unfortunately I think is quite possible. And the Iranians, what they would do in such a scenario is to drag the conflict on by measuring the barrage of missiles that they launch against Israel. To some extent, it is already happening, as you probably noticed, but they can drag it on for weeks and months. I don't want to say years, but it can be very long. Israel will try to negate this option by escalating more and more and targeting perhaps Khamenei himself or other strategic targets in Iran and so on. But it's hard to, it's not possible to negate the possibility that this attrition will go on for a long period of time. And last but not least is the diplomatic way out, whereby the Americans, perhaps with the assistance of others, maybe Putin, maybe the Saudis, maybe the Omanis, maybe even some Europeans, push the two sides into a new diplomatic agreement. And here, again, I ran out of time, so I won't elaborate now, but what I have in mind, on the one hand, is a new nuclear agreement that I suspect will not bring Iran to total elimination of the project, but perhaps close to it. And again, there are many details here that I don't have time to detail. So that's kind of the first thing. The second might be, and this would be my advice, a bilateral agreement between Israel and Iran of non-belligerency. I think that's a historic opportunity that we now have, now that we have demonstrated our capabilities, now that we have the upper hand, and because the world now is much less orderly, let's put it this way, than what it was years ago. In other words, I don't think we can trust Trump or any other superpower to restrain Iran for us. And we are able to create, sorry, I have an incoming call, to create a balance of power and a balance of deterrence between us and the Iranians based on non-belligerency. We won't attack you, you won't attack us. And last but not least is obviously the Palestinian issue. And here I will close the cycle, if you want, or the loop from my first remark on Rabin and the linkage between the Iranian and the Palestinian issue. We all understand that the Gaza situation is unbearable and the war has to end. The hostages must be released. And there needs to be a diplomatic off-ramp that not only resolve the Gaza situation in the immediate and short term, but also brings about or kind of paves the road towards a final resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Israeli-Arab conflict. And that off-ramp exists in the way of the so-called Saudi-French initiative. There was a big conference that was supposed to take place virtually as we speak, between the 17th and the 20th of June. There was a preparatory meeting of civil society a few days before in Paris that I attended with many other Israelis and Palestinians. And it was a momentous event that unfortunately got derailed by this Israeli attack. And hopefully the end state of this entire regional mess, if you want, can be returning to the Saudi-French initiative. And once again, linking the end of the war with Iran, with the negation of Iran's nuclear capability, with the closing of the circle of peace between Israel and the Palestinians, and hopefully also the Syrians, the Lebanese, and others, within that new framework of the Saudi-French initiative, which I believe is quite promising. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. We already have so many questions in the group chat. And I think that maybe let's ask with your voice, if you can, raise your hand. And maybe choose only one question. Anyone wants to start with the voice? No, we're going to read the questions. I'll read the one that is short, and other people can choose what question they want to ask. How does the war with Iran influence the war in Gaza?
How does the war in Iran influence the war in Gaza? That's the question. I'll say this. There is, again, a narrative being pushed by Netanyahu and his cronies that now that we have succeeded with Iran, Hamas will soften its positions, and we will be able to finally bring about the so-called total victory over Hamas in Gaza. I think that's totally unrealistic, and it's not going to happen. Even more so, I believe that the only reason that we're still fighting in Gaza is because Netanyahu wants this fight to continue for his political reasons. Why do I say that? Because there is an agreement that Netanyahu himself signed in January of this year. You can all read it. It wasn't published formally, but you can Google it. It was published by a few media outlets, Middle East Eye and a few others. And it's a short agreement with 3 phases. And in the second phase, it clearly states Hamas releases all the hostages. The 2 parties agree to a permanent ceasefire. All Israeli soldiers leave Gaza. And that's the second phase. And the third is the beginning of reconstruction of Gaza. That's a formal agreement that Netanyahu signed, that the Biden administration initiated with, obviously, the active assistance of the Egyptians and the Qataris, and with the blessing of Donald Trump, which at the time was kind of just entering into office, or even before he was elected, if I remember correctly. No, it was after he was elected, but he was not still in office. So Netanyahu chose to break this agreement instead of executing phase 2, to simply break this agreement, even though Hamas was abiding by the agreement, and renew the war and tell a story to the Israeli public that he is now negotiating a new agreement, supposedly to bring about better terms or whatnot. And that's what he's been doing ever since. It's not a real negotiation. If he really wanted to free the hostages, all he needs to do is to implement the agreement that he already signed. And he's been trying to push the Hamas to change his positions unsuccessfully. And I doubt very much that Hamas's positions will be changed now. It can always happen. I might be wrong, but I don't think so. So in this respect, there is no direct connection between the war in Iran and the war in Gaza. That's kind of one end of the spectrum, the negative end, if you want. The positive end is exactly what I said just now, that if we had an Israeli government that was interested in a diplomatic solution to both the Iranian situation and the Palestinian situation, it now has a perfect opportunity to reframe the linkage between those 2 wars and those 2 conflicts in a very constructive and kind of positive way. To put it simply, one could end the war in Iran and end the war in Gaza and launch a regionally and internationally agreed framework for the creation of a totally new security architecture, regional security architecture, including normalization of relations with the Saudis, including a coalition against Iran in a tacit way, okay, because the Arab countries will not kind of collaborate with Israel against Iran formally. That's not going to happen. But there will be a set of agreements that will reshape the region in a way which is, the best that Israel can hope for. Of course, it is contingent upon an Israeli agreement to a 2-state solution, because the Saudis and the Emiratis and everybody else is telling Israel, we're willing to come to your assistance in Gaza. We're willing to send troops. We're willing to do stuff that we were never willing to do in Gaza, only if you agree, in principle, to a 2-state solution. And obviously, this government is not going to do that. So, while the strategic situation is that one could retie or relink the Iranian and the Gaza and Palestinian situation in a way which would be extremely conducive from the perspective of Israel's real strategic interests and its future, we have a government that is intent on the exact opposite.
Mhm. Thank you. We'll go back to the previous question. How do you assess the geopolitical significance of Ayatollah Khamenei prohibiting the development and use of weapons of mass destruction? Can such a religious ruling be considered a reliable foundation for non-proliferation commitments?
I'm not sure I heard you too well, but I think I understood. The question was Khamenei, how important he is, and what is his position on the nuclear issue? Did I get it right?
I think so, and you can correct it.
Okay. So, Khamenei is obviously old and has been in power for many, many years. He says no. Okay, so maybe you can ask the question.
Can you correct yourself? You can speak. So Khamenei prohibits the development and use of weapons of mass destruction.
I think it's about the fatwa that
Yes. Yes. Yes, it's true. This fatwa exists, and the Iranians use it a lot. Of course, the Israelis do not believe it. And to be frank, some other actors in the international community also don't buy it, but it does exist. And it correlates with Iran's official policy, which is we're not seeking nuclear weapons. As late as 24 hours ago, I just saw Christian Amanpour on CNN interviewing the deputy foreign minister of Iran. And that's what he said, we are not pursuing a nuclear weapon. This is not part of our national security doctrine. It is a contradiction to our beliefs and to our history and to our whatever. That's their official position. And as I said before, there is no proof, at least so far, there is no proof that was presented officially to the public or to the media or whatnot. To the contrary, there is no proof. And the official documents and assessments of, as I said, the Americans and the French and the Brits are all saying that, they're not pursuing a nuclear weapon, period. However, they are a threshold state. So it's only a matter of decision. And it is a risky situation from an Israeli perspective and also from the perspective of everybody else to simply leave it at that. It's a matter of decision and that's it. The kind of the preferred alternative is to kind of bring them back into an agreed framework where they will be obliged contractually, legally, diplomatically, strategically, vis-a-vis the Americans and the Russians and the Chinese and the Europeans and the entire world to, again, reinstate inspections, intrusive inspections and monitoring and all of that, to export a lot of the enriched uranium that they now have, probably to Russia. Essentially, a new JCPOA, a new agreement with improved terms from the perspective of Israel, the US, Europeans, and others, which will guarantee as much as possible that they will not be able to cross the threshold. That's it.
Thank you. And we'll move on to the next question. We know what happened, for example, in Iraq. I'll shorten what was asked, but are there any experts on authoritarian regimes involved in decision-making in the Israeli government?
The short answer is probably no. The role of experts in the decision-making processes of this Israeli government, to the best of my knowledge, is very limited. The role of anybody is limited. We are no longer, I'm sorry to say that, and it may sound harsh to some of you, but we are no longer a functioning democracy. And most of the institutions and the processes of decision-making that were in existence for decades, and especially the very delicate and intricate interface between the political echelons, the high-level decision makers, the prime minister, the foreign minister, the defense minister, the cabinet, on the one hand, and the highest echelons of the military and intelligence establishment, the chief of the IDF, chief of Mossad, chief of Shin Bet, and chief of intelligence, chief of Air Force, whatnot. I've been, and this I'm saying from personal experience, I've been to many cabinet meetings and more closer forums than the cabinet, because the cabinet is always problematic in terms of leakages and so on, with many prime ministers. And there was always a certain, there are formalities. For example, how do you declare a war? There's a law that dictates how you do that. And then there are the norms and practices that are being shaped over the course of decades. And there were always complex relations between the professionals and the politicians. And it exists in any country, and it also existed in Israel. What has happened now in the last few years, because of Netanyahu, because of the dictatorial coup that he's forcing, because of the war that he essentially declared on the most important institutions of this country, including the military, including the Shin Bet, including Bagatz, the Supreme Court, including the Attorney General, and so on and so forth. We now have a situation that, whereas in the past we had checks and balances and we had orderly decision-making processes where, again, I'm testifying from personal experience, there was a certain way that things were being done, even though it was not necessarily dictated by law. But there were certain norms and standards and practices. It's all gone. And now it's Netanyahu with Ron Dermer, who's an unelected official with no military experience whatsoever. And they are the ones calling the shots. And everybody else needs to fall in line, or as Smotrich said in cabinet, and it was leaked, he said to the newly appointed chief of the IDF that they appointed just a few months ago. And they tried to force him to take charge of the humanitarian supply chain in Gaza. And he said, I'm not going to do it. Israeli soldiers will not be the ones handing food packages to Gazans, because it's not, it runs against my better judgment as a professional. So Smotrich told him around the cabinet table, listen, you need to do it. And if you won't do it, we'll replace you with somebody else who will. So that's not the way that relations between politicians and professionals in the past were handled. But we're in a completely new terrain now. And therefore, personally, I have zero trust in this government and in the way it conducts business. I am quite sure that they are not listening to experts. And if they bring experts, they bring those experts that they know are in line with them politically, which is also, an old trick of certain types of regimes. And so that's my long answer to your short question. They don't use experts, and if they do, they use them in a manipulative way.
That's very sad to hear. I'll ask the last question that can be breached very well with what you've just said. How is the current situation affecting public opinion on Netanyahu and his coalition? What do people think about them now?
Yeah. The jury is still out on that. I hope that the early indications we have with the latest poll, I think it was Channel 13 yesterday, that showed that there is no significant change in public opinion, despite the fact that there is wide-ranging support for the war. It doesn't translate into wide-ranging support of the government, because people, are not going to forget October 7th, and then they're not going to forget the dictatorial coup, and they're not going to forget the fact that this government is, on the one hand, burdening the reservists and the military in an unprecedented way, and with the other hand, simultaneously releasing the ultra-Orthodox and trying to give them a permanent exemption from military service in a way that runs against not only Israel's interests, but also 80%, the will of 80% of the Israelis. So people are not forgetting that. And so far, Netanyahu is not reaping the kind of political dividends that he probably hoped for. I hope this will remain. I'm not sure. And I also think, unfortunately, as I said during that briefing, I don't think that there's going to be a quick win, the kind of quick win that Netanyahu is hoping for. And this will also probably have its effect politically. So while anything can happen, and maybe we'll see one of, who Amit Segal is, Netanyahu's main, in Hebrew we say shofar, the main propaganda tool of Netanyahu in Channel 12, Amit Segal, the most influential, unfortunately, journalist, quote unquote, in Israel. We will probably see a poll of his tomorrow in Ulpan Shishi, and I wouldn't be surprised if it will show a significant leap in Netanyahu's popularity. But take it with more than a grain of salt, and we'll see. It's hard to say where public opinion is now, and obviously where it will be down the road. But I have to say, I hope that Netanyahu will not be able to gain politically from this very risky bet that he took against Iran, and obviously that he will be made to pay the price that he must pay for all his crimes and his horrible decisions that were made leading to October 7th, with the dictatorial coup, and since October 7th, across the board, almost. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's the time. And there are more questions in the chat. We, can continue discussing them in a written form, like amongst us. Thanks a lot that you found the time to come and talk to us. And thanks to Tasha from Tzedek Centers for finding us such a wonderful speaker. Thanks everyone for coming and for your interest. Hope to see you later.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good evening and a safe night.